Alders. Thank you for being here with me today. Let's talk about House Bill 3225. It recently passed the House after roughly 2 hours of debate right on the floor. What were your thoughts on it passing?
Well, I'm grateful that the Texas House passed this important legislation to protect our Texas kids. House Bill 3225 is really a common sense piece of legislation aimed at protecting our kids from inappropriate and sexually explicit material. That is the sole goal of this piece of legislation, is to ensure that our children are not confronted with material that is sexually explicit when they are browsing the minor section of the library. And so I'm very grateful that my colleagues joined me in passing this important piece of legislation.
One thing that stood out to me as I was listening to the debate was you felt as though, I believe it was Representative Johnson, the terms she was using were almost proving your point. What made you say that?
Well, it was interesting the direction she went in her questioning was really an aggressively and explicit in manner, and there were actually children serving as pages on the House floor. There were kids up in the gallery, and we actually had to take a moment to clear the kids out of the House, off the House floor and out of the House gallery because of the nature in which she wanted to ask questions related to the bill. And I made the point that this is exactly why we have to have this piece of legislation, because there is content that exists in the minor sections of libraries today that contains material that is incredibly explicit. And our children don't deserve to come upon that without warning. They need to be guided by their parents in an appropriate fashion, and that was the sole purpose of my piece of legislation.
Now, I asked you about a specific, part of what was heard on the floor, but was there anything in particular that stood out to you while the bill was being debated?
I think one of the moments when I was discussing the issue with Representative Zwiener, I think there was an important point that was made, which is the standards that we have for ourselves in society, and the fact that we've kind of numbed ourselves as the public to the kind of content that we interact with. And it's to the point today that I think we really struggle to recognize what's explicit and what's not. We've become so numb, we don't realize it's actually bad for us, and it's particularly bad for our children. And that moment, I think, was really important in the overall debate. And it's why we're debating this issue. We're talking about, making sure we reinforce HB 900, which passed last session, related to public school libraries, dealing with the definition of obscenity and consequences for obscene materials. These are all related to the issue of being numb to what is around us and recognizing there's actually a point in which we go too far, and we've allowed too much explicit material in our culture, and we've got to fight back against that. We have to reclaim our culture.
When you say we need to reclaim our culture, what do you explicitly mean by that?
I think we need to reestablish a standard for ourselves in society, that it's important for us to be looking out for the common good. That's why we have laws. I mean, we're down here passing laws because we believe that it's good for society. That is the nature of the legal system, is to protect one person from another person. And so we need to remind ourselves that there are standards. And we used to have these standards pretty much across the board in this country, and it used to be that this kind of thing was, outside of town and on the edge of town, and you'd have explicit stores and that kind of thing, and it was more of a hidden part of culture that no one wanted to recognize. And now it's in your face. It's on your TV screen, and it's in the minor sections of libraries. This piece of legislation, House Bill 3225, addressed explicit materials in minor sections of public libraries, and I'm very proud that we did a small part in protecting our Texas kids.
Some may say, a bill like this is something that the government should not be legislating on, that it should be entirely up to the parents, not a government decision. What would you say to that criticism?
Well, I think what I'm doing in HB 3225 is actually returning that that responsibility back to parents. We are not getting rid of books. We are moving books that contain this kind of material to the adult section of the library and specifying that a minor with adult permission, with their guardian or parents' permission, can access these materials, access the adult section of the library, where we've asked or where we are requiring that these books be moved to. So we're returning the power back to parents where they had no authority or no way of being able to step in the way of a child interacting with unknowingly being confronted with this kind of material in the minor section currently.
And some parents or guardians may also feel that this is an inconvenience. You know, I want to drop my child off at the library. I'm going to be gone shopping, doing errands for a couple hours. I want them to look at whatever book they want. What would you say to those who do feel this is an inconvenience to them?
Look, I mean, when we look at the content of these books, it is explicit in nature. It is, I believe it is a difficult case to make that this is the kind of content that is good for children. There is a potentially an appropriate way to handle and encounter the kind of material that we are talking about moving to the adult section, but it's the kind of conversation that needs to be had in a very mature way and a guided way, and it's not something that a 14 or 13 or 15-year-old just needs to come upon for the first time. That's not the place for that kind of a conversation to occur, and really, I believe that by requiring these books to be moved to the adult section, a parent could more easily drop their kid off at the library and know that their kid is safe in the minor section. They're able to go through the children's section, the young adult section, and safely pull any book off the shelf.
But that same parent may say this is a bill that's not necessarily empowering. It is serving as that inconvenience. You wouldn't agree with that.
If a parent wants their child to be able to interact with this kind of material, they can ensure that their kid has access.
And I also do want to ask, there was talk about the Miller test on the House floor, which does define obscenity. And there are provisions in this bill, libraries would meet, it's my understanding, to determine, what is sexually explicit and what is not. Some may say that is a bit subjective. What's sexually explicit to one person may not be to another.
Sure.
So how do you, work to ensure that individuals are on the same page about what is and what is not sexually explicit?
So the definition that we included was particular. It was very detailed in how we are defining sexual conduct, and we're taking that from the penal code so that it's very clear what we are discussing. And we're not talking about some inference. We're talking about sexual conduct and an illustration of that, or a depiction or writing that includes and details the sexual conduct that is specified in the bill. And I think it's pretty difficult to create a gray area. I think the definition we've included is pretty black and white.
I remember I spoke with Grassroots America a little bit ago, and they said this was a bill that they supported. Did you work with them throughout the process of getting it on the House floor, and what was that like?
Sure. Well, it was an issue that we faced here in our community. Unfortunately, we have in our Tyler Public Library, we've had an issue with books that contain sexually explicit content, and it's been a debate in our community whether or not the library needed to move those books. And so the idea for this has come from our own community, has come from folks like Grassroots and parents being involved and saying, we need somebody to do something about this. What is our recourse? And so that's what this is aiming to do, is provide that recourse and provide the guidelines so that our kids are protected in our own community and kids across the state of Texas, so that this kind of content is not available to minors.
I asked you a bit earlier about some potential criticisms about this bill, and I want to ask you about one more.
Sure.
Some may say that this is a form of censorship. What would you say to that?
Absolutely not. We're not getting rid of the books, as I mentioned before. We're not banning books. This is not anything like that. We are moving the books and saying, look, there is a maturity level that's needed, and that maturity level is being an adult or not, because what we're talking about, the kind of content we're talking about, is adult content. And the reality could be that younger teens may interact with this kind of content somewhere else. But what we don't want them to do is be confronted with it for the first time in the kids section of the public library. That's not where you should have that interaction. And the reality is their parents should be involved in helping bring them to an adult understanding of some of these issues.
Are there any books that come to your mind that you've shown your family or that you've heard of that you feel do not belong in a minor section of a library?
We've seen a lot of these books, and I've read way too many excerpts. But it's the kind of content we are regular attendees of our public library. Our girls love to browse and pull a dozen books off and check them out, and they get through them quickly, and then they're back. And I want to ensure that anyone else's 12 and 13-year-old has the ability to browse the collections that we have in our own public library, but any other community across the state, and do so safely.
But any book in particular that stick out to you?
No, we have not had thankfully, had one of these books pulled off the shelf.
And what impact do you feel this will have if it's signed into law?
Look, it's going to have meaningful impact across the state of Texas, because it draws a clear line about what is appropriate and what is not for our children in the state of Texas. And it's one small step, but it is a step in the right direction of protecting our Texas kids. It's something that we've emphasized this legislative session, and I'm excited to play a small role in getting that done.
And this would take effect, just to be clear, this would take effect starting September 1st.
That is correct, and we did work though with the Texas Library Association to develop a timeline by which the penalties would not come into play until later, because we wanted to ensure that the guidelines that we are providing in 3225 are capable of actually taking effect. And we wanted to ensure that we got the library's input so that they could implement those guidelines in an effective way, and it wasn't a haphazard process. And so we worked very closely with them as we were writing this bill to ensure the guidelines and the timeline that we put in place in the legislation was one that they could actually accomplish.
You mentioned that those penalties won't come until later. Do you have a date?
I can't remember the exact date. I believe it is the beginning of 2027. So they have, I believe, 18 months to make sure they've actually combed through and gotten these materials out. And we've created another path so they can immediately let folks know this is what the legislature passed, and we are working to implement those guidelines. So the public is aware of what we're trying to accomplish here.
And then if they don't comply, they can lose funding, taxpayer funding.
They could lose funding. They could also get fined. If they don't move materials that contain this kind of content, then there is a potential civil penalty of $10,000 per violation.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about this bill?
This is an incredibly important bill to protect Texas kids. I'm excited to have worked on it. I'm grateful for the Texas House getting it passed, and we look forward to it passing the Senate and headed to the governor's desk soon.